the League of Nations was not successful in preventing World War II. So after the war, the United Nations was created with a bigger mandate and more resources. But why was it created? What were its goals? And is the UN today still relevant? This is the rise of the United Nations. We are living in an age of globalization. Technology has shrunk our world and brought us closer together than ever before. Just a click of a button, we can communicate with anyone, anywhere in the world. However, this was not always the case. For most of human history, nation-states have been isolated from each other and pursued their own interests independently. This all changed with the creation of the League of Nations and then the United Nations, the first truly global international organization whose stated goal was to unite the world. But before we get into that, let's first understand why the UN was created. To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century and understand how the world became so unstable. The two world wars were being fought within 30 years of each other. Europe had been the cradle of civilization and home to some of the most influential ideas of all time. But by the early 20th century, it had descended into an orgy of violence and destruction. As the French writer André Gide put it, "If I wanted to write the history of my time, I would have to write a detailed account of all the stupidities committed by the grown-ups." There were many factors that led to this catastrophic state of affairs. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Europe and quickly spread across the continent. This led to unprecedented economic growth and technological advancement, but also to severe social problems such as poverty, inequality, and overcrowding. Europe's colonial empires were also coming under increasing strain, as the colonized peoples began to demand independence. Furthermore, new ideologies such as communism and fascism were challenging the existing order and creating tensions between nations. Finally, there was a complete lack of international cooperation. European powers pursued their own interests without considering the impact on others, which only made things worse. Ultimately, these tensions came to a head in 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. This sparked a chain reaction that led to the outbreak of World War I, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. By 1918, over 16 million people had been killed, and entire generations had been wiped out. In the aftermath of the war, Europe was left in ruins, and the world was plunged into another economic crisis. But perhaps even more important than the material damage was the loss of faith in the old order. It was clear to everyone that something had to change if another global conflict was to be avoided. Enter the League of Nations. The League was founded in 1920 with the stated goal of preventing another world war. At its core was the idea of collective security, which held that if all nations would agree to work together and uphold the principles of the League, it would be impossible for any single nation to wage war on another. In practice, however, this meant that if a member nation went to war, the rest of the League would have to declare war on them, which was easier said than done. The League also lacked a military force of its own and relied on member nations to contribute troops to any peacekeeping missions. As you can imagine, this proved to be a major obstacle, as many nations were reluctant to commit their resources to such endeavors. Furthermore, the League was not truly representative of all nations. Many countries outside of Europe were not members, and those that were often had veto power over decisions, meaning that the organization was often paralyzed by disagreement. Despite these flaws, the League did achieve some success in its early years, notably in resolving several territorial disputes in Eastern Europe. However, as the 1930s rolled around, it became clear that the League was not enough. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany and the Japanese invasion of China showed that the world was on the verge of another catastrophic conflict. And so in 1945, after 6 years of fighting in the deadliest war in human history, the United Nations was born. The UN was founded on the principle of cooperation and dialogue. Its primary goals were to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation in solving economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems, and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. To do this, the UN established a number of bodies, including the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice. The Security Council is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. The General Assembly is responsible for promoting international cooperation, and the International Court of Justice is responsible for settling legal disputes between nations. In addition to these primary goals, The UN also has a number of other important functions. For example, it provides humanitarian aid to refugees and other victims of conflict. It works to promote sustainable development, and it helps to coordinate responses to global crises, such as pandemics and natural disasters. The UN is funded by member contributions and by voluntary donations from individuals and organizations. The UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945, by the representatives of 50 countries who met in San Francisco. The Charter sets out the goals and principles of the United Nations and was drafted in large part by the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. These 4 countries, along with China, became the founding members of the organization and held considerable power within its structure. The UN Charter came into effect on October 24, 1945, and the first session of the General Assembly was held in London on January 10, 1946. Now that we know how the UN was created, let's take a look at its primary goals and functions. As we mentioned earlier, the UN was created with the primary goal of maintaining international peace and security. In order to do this, the UN has a number of important bodies. The most powerful is the Security Council, which has the authority to make binding decisions on all member nations. The Security Council is composed of 15 members, 5 of which are permanent, and 10 of which are elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council are China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These countries have veto power, meaning that they can block any decision from being made. The Security Council has the power to authorize military action, impose sanctions, and deploy peacekeeping missions. However, it is only as strong as its member nations. If any one of the 5 permanent members casts a veto, then the Security Council cannot act. Additionally, the Security Council has been criticized for being undemocratic since the 5 permanent members do not represent the majority of countries and can often act in their own self-interest. Another important body of the UN is the General Assembly. As the name suggests, the General Assembly is a more representative body that includes all member nations. In the General Assembly, each country has 1 vote, regardless of size or power. The General Assembly can debate and make recommendations on any issue it wants to, but it does not have the power to make binding decisions. Finally, there is the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. The International Court of Justice is responsible for settling legal disputes between nations. It is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and its decisions are binding on member states. However, the court only has jurisdiction over cases where both countries agree to submit to its authority. While the UN has been successful in some areas, such as promoting economic development and protecting human rights, it has been less successful in its primary goal of maintaining peace. There are a number of reasons for this. First, the UN is often too slow to respond to crises. By the time the UN Security Council has made a decision, it is often too late to prevent hostilities from erupting. Second, the UN relies on member nations to contribute troops for peacekeeping missions, which can be problematic since countries often have competing interests. This can lead to peacekeeping missions being understaffed or ill-equipped to handle the situation on the ground. Third, the UN has no enforcement power of its own. It can impose sanctions or threaten military action, but ultimately it relies on member nations to enforce its decisions. This can be problematic since countries often act in their own self-interest rather than in the interest of the UN. Finally, the UN has been criticized for being biased against certain countries, particularly in the Middle East. Many believe that the UN favors Israel over Palestine, which has led to increased tensions in the region. So what does the future hold for the UN? It faces an uncertain future. Some believe that it is outdated and no longer relevant in a globalized world. Others argue that it is essential for maintaining peace and stability. Only time will tell what the future holds for this once groundbreaking institution. That was the rise of the United Nations. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, post a past for more content. Thanks for watching.